All right, so this is part 2 of your photosynthesis lecture. This is looking at photosynthesis specifically. So you have the overall equation in your outline. So we know that we are going to take carbon dioxide, the inorganic carbon dioxide, inorganic water. We're going to add some light energy, and we're going to produce sugar. The glucose is not pictured in here, but we have to make glucose, and then oxygen is given off as a gas, as a waste product. All right, so we're going to look at, here's a question for you. So pause the video and think about it. All right, so if you did pause the video, you should have come up with the answer. I actually haven't read this one yet. So produces products with higher stored energy. Yes, it's endergonic, letter A. Okay, because we're putting energy into the whole process. So your output is going to have higher energy. Glucose has higher energy than either carbon dioxide or water combined. Okay, all right. So when we talk about the light reaction, there's two reactions to photosynthesis. There's something called the light reaction, and there's something called, can also be called the light dependent reaction, because this really depends on light being there. So sunlight, the sun has to be shining. And then there's another reaction called the Kelvin cycle. It's the old name used to be the dark reaction because it can happen in the dark. And it's also called the light independent reaction because it doesn't need the light to happen. Anyhow, if you read in your outline for letter B, the light reaction, this is going to convert our solar energy to chemical energy. So the whole reason why plants are harnessing light, right, is to get energy. And remember that the usable form of energy inside of a cell is ATP. So we somehow have to convert, we somehow have to convert the energy that's in sunlight, we have to convert that to ATP. All right, so in the light reaction, there are two photosystems. And let me just explain what a photosystem does, right? So we know that we're happening in the thylakoid membrane of a chloroplast. And a photosystem, if you look at your outline, photosystems are a cluster of pigments embedded into the thylakoid membrane. There is a reaction center, chlorophyll A, and antenna pigments. So what you're looking at here is a photosystem. It's basically just a little grouping of pigments, all right? So see here the word antenna pigment molecules. These look all green, but they could be all your other colors. They can be the chlorophyll, they can be the xanthophylls, right? They can be yellows, they can be carotenoids, they can be oranges, they can be anthocyanins, which is our blue. So these antenna pigments are around, but we want to pay special attention to something called the reaction center chlorophyll. So just by where it is in the middle, and it has to be chlorophyll A, I'm going to add a little A here, it has to be chlorophyll A. What happens is when the sun hits this photosystem, the photosystem, every single molecule here, every single pigment is going to pick up that light. And I just finished telling you in the first part that all pigments absorb certain wavelengths of light. So the different colors here will absorb different energies of light, and they all will vibrate. So imagine all of these kind of vibrating as they get hit with the sun. These vibrational energy is going to be passed, as you see in the black arrows, right? We're passing all this vibrational energy to this reaction center chlorophyll. So everything goes to the middle. The reaction center chlorophyll is getting so excited that it's going to lose a couple of electrons. So let's go back in this next slide here. So this is what I was talking about. This is a photosystem. We can see all different kinds of colors, the colored pigments in the photosystem. Light comes in, and it's going to go to this reaction center chlorophyll here, right? This reaction center chlorophyll picks up all the energy from all the photosystem around it, and it's going to shoot 2 electrons into a higher orbital or a higher energy state. So it gets so excited, it basically pops off 2 electrons, okay? So these electrons are necessary. They're going to be used very, very quickly. So let's look at that. Don't worry about this heat and fluorescence. This is only if you let those electrons fall back down, then that extra energy gets given off as heat and fluorescence, but we're not going to do that. Not going to pay attention to that. All right, so let's look at the whole thing in one picture, then we'll go through and dissect each little part of it. So we were just looking at this, right? Well, actually, let me turn to the next. Here's the whole picture. These two green areas here and here, right, these green circles, those are both photosystems. It turns out there's two different kinds of photosystems, and they both have a certain job. This photosystem here is called the water splitting photosystem because you can see that water is being split, okay? This one is called the NADPH producing photosystem because it makes a molecule of NADPH. So both of them work pretty similarly. When I was talking about, let's go back, when I was talking about how sunlight is harnessed to sort of boost 2 electrons away from our chlorophyll A in the reaction center, that's what happens in photosystems, okay? So it happens in both this one and this one. So let's start. We see light coming in to the photosystem here. Remember that previous picture where all the energy goes to the reaction center chlorophyll, okay? Now, the reaction center chlorophyll gets so excited, it shoots up 2 electrons into this higher energy state. It basically just almost loses them. And it does lose them because right next to the reaction center chlorophyll is going to be an electron transport chain. This transport chain is something that we talk about in cellular respiration. It's exactly the same electron transport chain. And if you remember that, then you will remember that the whole process of the electron transport chain generates ATP, okay? So what we've done now is we have taken the energy in the electrons, right? That energy from the sun was used to pop off 2 electrons. Those 2 electrons were passed down an electron transport chain, and how are they used? They were used to make ATP. So right away we can see we use the sun. We use the sun to create ATP. Okay? Now let's look at the second one here. So the same thing, sunlight comes in, it energizes 2 electrons away from chlorophyll A. And then this one's slightly different. There's no electron transport chain, but here's our Uber. Our Uber is slightly different. It has a P. The P is for photosynthesis. Okay, so remember NAD was used in cellular respiration, and now it's NADP for photosynthesis. But it's the same deal. Those 2 electrons are going to get carried in the Uber, okay, and they're going to make a molecule of NADPH. So I circled the 2 products of the light reaction that are really important for the dark reaction or the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle needs ATP and it needs NADPH. It needs those electrons. Those are the 2 inputs that the Calvin cycle requires. Okay? So we're almost done. Now, it's kind of funny because we now have a reaction center chlorophyll. Let's start here. This reaction center chlorophyll just gave up 2 of its electrons, right? It just gave those to Uber, the NADPH. Well, now it needs electrons, right? Where is it going to get new electrons? Or we need to refill those electrons, or else we just ruined our reaction center chlorophyll. Well, where are they coming from? Hey, guess what? The electron transport chain, right? The 2 electrons are coming in and they're going to refill that chlorophyll A. So how convenient, right? So remember, these 2 electrons actually came from this chlorophyll A. Well, that leaves this chlorophyll A. Where is this chlorophyll A going to get refilled? There's no more electrons coming down an electron transport chain here, and that is why we need water. So water is split in a separate side reaction. When it's split, water becomes 2 electrons, which go get refilled which refill chlorophyll A here. It also becomes water, which is the waste product, right, of photosynthesis product. And then it also creates an H+, which is not written here. So that is the gist of it. So let's take a look at this one more time in a different way. I just want to make sure you guys really understand this. Okay, so here's the first photosystem. Okay, so what are these little gray circles representing? Those are representing pigments, right? And the sunlight's coming in, and what's going to happen is that 2 electrons are going to get pulled up, right? So 2 electrons are going to shoot away from that reaction center chlorophyll. Here is your electron transport chain. So those 2 electrons are going to come and they're going to get passed down the electron transport chain. Remember the electron transport chain, what it does? It pumps protons, right? Here's our friend, our hydrogen ion or a proton. These proteins are going to pump the protons into that thylakoid membrane, right? Remember the thylakoid membranes are hollow. And so they're going to push these protons into the inside. What does that do? What was the electron transfer chain for? It was to create a concentration gradient, right? So we're making a hydrogen ion, concentration gradient, where we have a higher concentration of H pluses inside, and we have a lower concentration of H pluses outside. Outside here, this is a low concentration. Here, there's a high concentration. So follow your protons here, follow your hydrogen ions. They're going to flow down their concentration gradient through our good friend ATP synthase. Same thing here. This flow of protons through the ATP synthase is what gives the energy to the enzyme to make ATP. So it's going to add that phosphate group, making ATP. Okay. So that's photosystem 1. And then photosystem 2, we have the same sunlight coming in. 2 electrons are being catapulted into a higher energy state, but those 2 electrons are going to go right to NAD+, and they're going to make NADPH. So here's our 2 major, again, our major outputs of the light reaction, because the Calvin cycle needs, here's the Calvin cycle, it needs both NADPH and it needs ATP. Okay? Now, remember refilling those electrons from our chlorophyll, our reaction center chlorophyll. In this photosystem, remember, how are the electrons put back? Oh, they just come down the chain and they're going to get refilled from the first photosystem. In this photosystem, where do our electrons come from? They come from splitting water, right? The 2 electrons, when water is split, it splits into oxygen, electrons, and also H pluses. The H pluses just get absorbed in the H plus gradient. So these 2 electrons go to refill the electrons in our first photosystem, the chlorophyll A in the first photosystem. Okay? So I know it's pretty complicated, but hopefully you can keep step by step, keep up with it, understand the story that you hear, and then when you read the book and you read the notes, it'll just make more sense. It's one of those topics that you have to revisit again and again and again, and then one of those times it'll click, believe me. Okay, so here's a concept check. When a photon of the correct energy is absorbed by a photosystem, an electron is energized and transferred to a primary electron acceptor. This creates an electron hole. How is the missing electron replaced? Okay, so what's the correct answer? you should have chosen B. Okay, electron from hydrogen made available by splitting water replaces the missing electron. All right. The oxygen produced in photosynthesis comes from what molecule? Hopefully, you came up with water. Okay, so go back to here. Here's our oxygen, our waste product. Here is water, right? So water is split and it creates oxygen, and that's our waste. All of the following are products of the light reaction except. So what do we get out of the light reaction? Do we get oxygen? Yes, we do. Do we get glucose? No, we don't. Do we get ATP? Yes. Do we get NADPH? Yes. All right, so the answer is B, oxygen. I'm sorry, glucose. All right, so that was it with the light reaction, okay? Now, let's look at the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is endergonic. It requires energy as well. The energy it requires is ATP, okay? And the ATP is made by the light reaction. And so the light reaction gives the Calvin cycle what it needs to proceed. The Calvin cycle also needs electrons, so it gets that from the NADPH that was also created in the light reaction. So there's not a whole lot of detail in the Calvin cycle that I'm requiring. All you need to know is this is where carbon dioxide comes in. Oops, sorry about that. So the carbon dioxide is a gas in the atmosphere. There's an enzyme that plants have that put that carbon dioxide, attach it to an organic molecule, and that happens in the Calvin cycle. So what this is called, it's called carbon fixation. When you fix carbon, you take it as a gas and you put it into an organic molecule. Okay, that's really important. So carbon fixation is what happens in the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide is used. It's a building block to make our sugar molecule, right? So this sugar eventually becomes glucose, and that's what you see pictured here. This hexagon is glucose. But I will say that I do mention that the output, the immediate output of the Calvin cycle is actually a 3-carbon molecule called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P. And G3P is what is initially put out, and then eventually another chemical reaction will make glucose. So for simplicity's sake, and for just like having a nice, tidy overall equation, we say glucose. Okay, so glucose is the product, but we know, right, that the actual initial output is G3P. But it is an organic molecule, and eventually it does make glucose. All right, so we're using up our energy, we're using up our electrons to make this happen, and then so the Calvin cycle will spit out ADP to get recharged in the light reaction, and it also spit out our empty electron carrier, our NADP. All right, so let's work with this a little bit. So here's the same picture. We're just going to fill in the blanks, right? So what's happening here? These are the thylakoid membranes. This is going to represent the light reaction portion. What are the inputs to the light reaction? We are going to need our water. Okay, so let's put water as one of these. We also need sunlight, right? Okay. And now what do we get out of our light reaction? We're going to get, I think this is already here, the NADPH, but we're also going to get ATP, right? ATP and NADPH are going to be used. This guy's called the Calvin cycle. What is going to go into the Calvin cycle, right? So this is our Calvin cycle, and we're going to have carbon dioxide being fixed. Remember that word, fixed. We're going to use our ATP and NADPH. We're going to get G3P, which eventually becomes glucose. Oh, I'm sorry. The waste product, oxygen, is being made here. And if we want to fill in the last blank, right? What is NADPH? When it's empty, it's just called NADP. All right. So the last topic in your outline is basically C3, C4, and CAM plants. It turns out that there are slightly different kinds of plants dealing with different kinds of environments. So if you look at your notes, a C3 plant is where the first organic product is this 3-carbon molecule, just like what we talked about, the G3P, okay? They close their stomata on hot days. The stomate and stomata is the same. So stomate's one, stomata is plural, on hot days to prevent dehydration. But if you close your stomates, then your carbon dioxide is low and photosynthesis stops. C4 and CAM plants have evolved a way to store carbon dioxide. So on really, really hot days, even if they have to close their stomates, they store their carbon dioxide so they can use it even though they're not, quote unquote, breathing, even though they're not allowing the gases to come into their leaves during the day. So C4 will store the carbon dioxide as a 4-carbon compound, which is why it's called C4. Okay? And it just donates that to another cell. So there's a specialized cell that stores it, and then it will donate the carbon dioxide to run the Calvin cycle. Okay? The CAM plant is basically the same thing, except we don't have a separate cell. Everything is in one cell. We're still storing carbon dioxide as a 4-carbon compound, and we're allowing photosynthesis to happen because we have stored carbon dioxide. So it's just a way, both of these mechanisms are ways for plants to be able to live in very hot environments so that they can store their carbon dioxide even though they can't exchange gases because they have to close their stomates. Okay? All right. So the Calvin cycle requires each of the following inputs except, all right, hopefully you came up with letter B, oxygen. Oxygen is not used in the Calvin cycle. It's a waste product. And then this is just a little exercise that I can go through with you. We're going to put C for chloroplast and M for mitochondria, or B for both chloroplasts and mitochondria. So the main goal, so let's look at number 7. The main goal is to produce a lot of ATP energy. This would be the mitochondria, right? I contain pigments to help capture light energy. Hopefully that's easy. This is the chloroplast. Oxygen gas production will happen within me. So what creates oxygen gas? That's going to be the chloroplast. I can be found in a plant cell. Plants have chloroplasts and they have mitochondria. So that's both. I can be found in animal cells. Well, animal cells don't photosynthesize. They only have cellular respiration, so just the mitochondria. Carbon dioxide gas production will happen within me. So what process creates carbon dioxide? That would be the mitochondria. Muscle cells would contain a lot of me. Well, plants don't have muscle, so that must be mitochondria. And mitochondria, that's true. Muscles are very energetic. They need a lot of energy, and so they're going to have a lot of mitochondria to produce that energy. Water production will happen within me. What produces water? Is it photosynthesis or cell respiration? Cell respiration. Glucose production will happen within me. What makes glucose? That's going to be a chloroplast. I would be found within a photosynthetic protist. So that'll be definitely chloroplast, but also mitochondria. So both, because remember, photosynthetic organisms also respire. I am the site of aerobic cellular respiration. That is a mitochondria. Krebs and electron transport chain happen within me. So Krebs is also known as the citric acid cycle. So this is mitochondria. I contain chlorophyll. This is going to be, of course, chloroplast. And the Calvin cycle happens within me. This is also the chloroplast Calvin cycle. All right. Last couple of things. Just to give you an exercise of what kind of organisms can make their own food and what needs to obtain energy from the food they eat. So this is going to be, if you can make your own food, this is an autotroph. and then the opposite would be a heterotroph. And then just some examples of an autotroph: plants, algae. And then heterotrophs can be animals and fungi. Okay, just some examples. Last wrap up here. So this is actually very scary to some students, but it's the electron transport chain. Okay, so let's look at, this is really going to get you guys to hopefully learn the electron transport chain. So this is the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain happens in both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Okay, so since you've already had cellular respiration and we saw it in photosynthesis, I want you guys to think about cellular respiration. Okay. So this letter B is going to be the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So this is the inner membrane. Then this area is going to be between the two membranes. So this is called the intermembrane space. And then the area below is called the matrix. Okay. So let's see what's going on. The white line is going to be electron path. What is going to initially drop off our electrons to the electron transport chain? So you guys can put NADH here. So when NADH drops off its electrons, it becomes NAD+. Okay. So remember these proteins? Remember this one and this one and this one? They were pumps, right? What did they pump through every time they got an electron? What did they pump? And hopefully you remember those are H pluses. So they're pumping H pluses across the membrane. Now, what here at the very end, you see the white line ending, what is it that picks up the electrons? What's the final electron acceptor within the electron transport chain? And hopefully you said oxygen. And when oxygen combines with those electrons, what does it make? It will make water. Okay? Now, we're not quite done yet. So the electron transport chain, you see these H pluses. The H pluses also have a place to go. They're going to run from high concentration to low concentration, right? What is this structure here with this rounded area? I think that's J. It's ATP synthase, right? This is the enzyme that makes ATP. So I think G, I'm just going to put another H plus here. So now this arrow is going to be what happens with ATP synthase. So ATP synthase is going to take ADP plus phosphate and make ATP, right? And then this G here is the same, so we're just moving those electrons down their concentration gradient. All right, we did it. See, it wasn't too bad. Everything in the bracket here is the electron transport chain, because the chain is really just the transportation of the electrons ultimately to oxygen, and then the ATP synthase happens on the side, but it happens because of the hydrogen ion. The concentration of hydrogen ions is high on one side and low on the other side. All right, both cellular respiration and photosynthesis are tough topics. I hope you guys read your book, read your notes, and any questions, come ask me.